Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Delighted to have you with us today for an exploration of an important chapter in American history. The last living major general of the Continental Army by 1824 hadn't been in the United States for some time. He'd been living in France, and his return was an epical moment in our nation's history. Exploring that chapter in our history, which spanned from 1824 to 1825, Ryan Cole has written a book that we're excited to discuss today, The Last Adieu, Lafayette's Triumphant Return, The Echoes of Revolution, and the Gratitude of the Republic. Ryan Cole is also the author of a book called Light Horse Harry Lee, Rise and Fall of a Revolutionary Hero, and has written much more. His writing has appeared in several publications such as the Wall Street Journal, American Heritage, Civil War Journal. After we hear from him, a glimpse into this triumphant return, I'm going to sit down both with Ryan and with Chuck Schwam, the executive director of the American Friends of Lafayette, to talk about not only Lafayette's tour and his return in 1824 and 1825, but how we, as a nation, have remembered that moment across our history, and particularly in the last few years, the bicentennial of that triumphant return. Chuck Schwam, in addition to being executive director of the American Friends of Lafayette, is the publisher of the Gazette of the American Friends of Lafayette, and was also the committee chair of the Lafayette Farewell Tour bicentennial effort that has held events throughout 2024 and 2025. We'll be taking questions from you, both the audience here in the room and those of you who are joining us online. You'll see an opportunity to submit questions in the chat. We will come to those, and we will once we sit down and have a short conversation, taking as many questions as possible. So be thinking about things you would like to know more. And now, please join me in welcoming Ryan Cole.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Kevin, this is the second time that you've hosted me at a very extraordinary venue with great importance to our country. My gratitude was already great, but it's boundless now to you and the staff at the Kluge Center for hosting this event in this magnificent building, just north of which, by the way, where the Supreme Court is now, once stood a brick house. From 1815 to 1819, while the building across the street, which was burned by the British in August of 1814, was being rebuilt, that house served as a makeshift capitol. On a warm spring day in 1817, James Monroe walked out of one of its doors onto a platform, took the oath of office, and for the last time in America's history, one of its revolutionary generation became president. Thus began what is often called the era of good feelings. But the moniker is not entirely accurate. The late 18-teens and early 1820s were a period of technological transformation, societal disruption, as well as political division between and estrangement among Americans. Since independence, the size of America had doubled. The number of its people had tripled. 13 colonies clustered around the Atlantic were, after 1821, now 24 states reaching the Mississippi River with designs on the Pacific coast. Innovations, such as the steam engine, Thomas Gilpin's papermaking machine, the publication of over 600 newspapers, and the federal government's expansive postal system, reduced distances, sped the flow of goods, and the dissemination of information. But a financial downturn in 1819, driven in part by vast amounts of land purchased by Western farmers on easy credit from poorly regulated banks, leveled the American economy and spread misery far and wide across the landscape. Missouri's application and entrance into the Union, and with it the westward drift of slavery, provoked a sectional crisis. The presidential election of 1824, a contest between four candidates, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson, from different factions of the Democratic-Republican Party, the winner of which would be the first man not of the Revolutionary era to lead the nation. This was a prelude to the enlarging democracy of the following decade, and it was fought so bitterly among partisans and litigated with such venom in the press, some commentators wondered if it might lead to the Union's demise. In the middle of this change and worry, the American people, as any people are wont to do, found comfort in nostalgia. They looked backwards to their revolution. The approach of the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1826 was accompanied by fresh curiosity in the era from which it had originated. New histories were published, engraved copies of the Declaration were marketed. In recently established states, communities were named for heroes of the Revolution long gone, while a national veneration rose for those who still lived. As the 1820s began, only 5 men who had signed the Declaration remained: John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, William Floyd, and Charles Thompson, who had signed the first printing of the document. When Floyd died in August of 1821, a national mourning followed. And thus, another patriot of the Revolution is gone, read the headline of one obituary. Revolutionary veterans remain, but their numbers thin regularly. With the passing of each old soldier, headlines cried, "Another hero gone." One great hero who was in a sense gone still lived. He had not set foot on American soil in 40 years. Cruelly, he had never seen the nation his sacrifices had helped create transformed. His name was Gilbert du Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette, or as Americans called him with great affection, General Lafayette. In 1818, William Eustis, another veteran of the Revolution and America's minister to the Netherlands, paid a visit to the general at Lagrange, his home outside of Paris. There, he observed that the Marquis de Lafayette, retired on his farm, waits patiently a better state of things. Lafayette had his own reasons to look back longingly on America's war for independence. When, as an inexperienced soldier, he had grown into a major general, had helped a people he had never met and a country he had never seen win its freedom, his service began with a bullet through the leg at the Battle of Brandywine, concluded with the Siege of Yorktown, which led to American independence. In between, he had become dear to the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, earned the trust of the American people, and helped win crucial French support for the rebels' war effort. After Cornwallis' surrender, Lafayette reached home at the beginning of 1782 a hero. A decade later, he was burned in effigy in Paris, and then languished in an Austrian prison with his wife and daughters, a hero turned casualty of France's tumultuous revolution. When he was at last freed in 1797 and returned home to his native country 2 years later, it was with the condition stipulated by Napoleon Bonaparte that he remain away from Paris and out of public life. When a national memorial service was held in Paris for George Washington, Lafayette was not invited. With the second restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, Lafayette reemerged, won a seat in the lower house of Parliament, the Chamber of Deputies, and fought to reestablish the rights won during the Revolution. Progress met with reaction when old revolutionaries were elected to office and violent Carbonari plots to overthrow the government, in which Lafayette took part, were foiled. In February of 1825, he was voted out of the chamber. There he sat, at Lagrange, in poor health, in debt, politically despondent, seeking comfort in thoughts of America. And as it turned out, he was on Americans' minds too. Tender letters, which he exchanged with fellow veterans of the Revolution, which he expressed hope to one day return to the U.S. in order to embrace them again, were shared with newspapers and printed widely. Rumors spread, excitement grew. General Lafayette wished to make one last voyage across the Atlantic. Congress took the initiative and passed a resolution of invitation for Lafayette to visit America and offered the use of a national ship to bring him here. He accepted the invitation, but refused the ship. Like he had done in 1777, he would find his own way to America. Of course, now he had no money to buy and outfit a vessel. So instead, on July 13th, 1824, he gathered up his son, George Washington Lafayette, a newly hired secretary named Auguste Levasseur, as well as his valet, and set sail on the packet ship Katniss. the use of which was offered by its captain free of charge. After a month at sea, on July 15th, the ship appeared off of Staten Island, where Lafayette was received by the Vice President, Daniel Tompkins. Standing on the portico of Tompkins' house, as crowds gathered around, Lafayette took note of a brilliant rainbow, a sign, he said, of happy omens. Now, Lafayette's energetic optimism was well known. Here it was well placed. So the 15th was a Sunday, and many states and localities forbid travel on the Sabbath. So it was not until the following Monday that Lafayette, at the center of a flotilla of steamboats, reached Manhattan. When he disembarked at Castle Garden on the Battery, the greatest tour in American history was underway, and 13 of the happiest months it would ever know began. On the way to City Hall, bells rang, flags fluttered, women waved and tossed handkerchiefs, while men shouted themselves hoarse. So overcome with the sight of the old hero, some men rushed to his carriage and attempted to unhook its horses so they could transport Lafayette the rest of the way to City Hall themselves. Once he reached City Hall, citizens, affluent, impoverished, black, white, young, old, waited to shake his hand. All agreed with the sentiments of one American who said to the general, "I am one of the 10 million individuals who owe you the happiness of liberty." From New York, it was on to Boston. On the road which led along Long Island Sound and into Rhode Island, businesses were closed in anticipation of Lafayette's arrival. If his route did not run through their communities, New Englanders rushed to ones where it did. If he departed before they arrived, those travelers embarked for the next town in hot pursuit. Schools were dismissed and the roads filled with young boys, hoping to catch up with the procession. The line of admirers following it grew so large, the cloud of dust it kicked up into the air could be seen for miles on the horizon and choked everyone in its wake. Even the horses pulling Lafayette were reminded of the weight and honor of their task. While a new carriage was being equipped in a Connecticut town, its driver admonished one of his horses, "Behave pretty now, Charlie. You're going to carry the greatest man in the world." In Boston, thousands of schoolchildren standing on in columns greeted Lafayette on the Commons. One broke ranks and was lifted to his carriage to present a wreath of laurels. A toast offered days later when Lafayette visited Harvard. May America grow old and Europe young. But the first generation of Americans, like Lafayette, had grown old. During his stay in Boston, Lafayette traveled to Quincy to dine with John Adams, who shrugged off his decrepitude and was temporarily revived by the reunion and their common recollections of their revolutionary past. It was not only Adams who was seemingly invigorated. Going on 3 hours of sleep a night, traveling constantly, Lafayette's companions, his son, his secretary, were exhausted and sick. He was standing up to everything as though, his secretary observed, he were a young 20. From Boston, they returned to New York, where an army of laborers converted Castle Garden into a spectacular amphitheater to host the greatest outdoor party in American history, in Lafayette's honor, of course. They went west to Philadelphia, where Lafayette entered the city, the center of a procession modeled on the Roman Triumphus, in which the returning general was paraded victoriously to the Temple of Jupiter on Capitoline Hill. But his destination was a temple of a different sort. In the weeks preceding his visit to Philadelphia, the room in which the Declaration of Independence was signed, which had sat purposeless and barely evading demolition for years, was refurbished to receive the nation's guests, as Americans took to calling him. When the transformation began in the summer of 1824, the city's planning committee's minutes referred to the building as the old State House. It had once been Pennsylvania's State House. By the time Lafayette arrived, it had taken on a new name, the Hall of Independence. What we call today Independence Hall. In Baltimore, George Washington's old war tents waited at Fort McHenry. Here in Washington, he passed through the Capitol and was received by President Monroe at the unpretentious home of the president. The elite of Paris, Lafayette's secretary imagined, would not leave the White House without proclaiming, "Dear God, how this sovereign house feels bourgeois." Lafayette made his return to Mount Vernon on October 17th, where he stepped into the crypt and reappeared with tears running down his face. Journalists, taking perhaps a touch of poetic license, claimed that a bald eagle hovered overhead during the visit. Chuck, Can we confirm that? In the fall, he traveled to Monticello. When Lafayette's carriage reached the summit of Carter's Mountain and he stepped down, Jefferson stepped off his porch, and the old men walked shakily towards each other, embracing and crying, "My dear Jefferson, my dear Lafayette," as they kissed one another on the cheek. As Lafayette traveled to eastern states, invitations were extended by their southern and western sisters. He was determined to accept them all. He waited out the winter here in Washington, and at the first sign of spring, departed the capital and headed south. For the next 4 months, he traveled by stagecoach and steamboat on primitive roads and dangerous waterways. He rode through the Carolina pine forest by the light of bonfires in the dead of night. He was pulled onto the shores of the Chattahoochee River by a band of Creek warriors. One of the Alabama militiamen who watched from the Alabama side claimed it was the greatest show of a river crossing he'd ever seen. He steamed up the Mississippi into the American frontier, reached St. Louis, crossed into the Ohio Valley, into western New York, along the Erie Canal, back to Boston in time, of course, to participate in the laying of a cornerstone at the monument at Bunker Hill on the 50th anniversary of that battle. Consecrating the memory of the Revolution as a representative of its army was not the conclusion of his visit, but it was the culmination, in my opinion. When he returned to France after a farewell at the President's house on September 7, 1825, it was on board a 44-gun frigate quickly outfitted and manned by sailors from many of the 24 states, summoned from the Navy Yard by President John Quincy Adams as a demonstration of American maritime might. It was christened the Brandywine. Brandywine brought Lafayette into Americans' hearts. It took them away from their shores forever. The mention of hearts speaks to the magnitude of this event, the level of excitement it created among Americans, no matter their class, their color. It consumed the country. So much so, it inspired a flowering of entrepreneurialism. Capitalists created and Americans bought boots, Lafayette boots, badges, umbrellas, hats, sashes, watch chains, gloves, pitchers, plates. Even in Lexington, Kentucky, a Lafayette jacket for men that its tailor claimed was dust resistant. I can't confirm that, by the way. The visit and Americans' admiration for Lafayette left behind a sizable physical legacy. It's difficult to say with certainty, but some historians say there's 80 towns and cities in the country named for Lafayette, as well as counties, townships, streets, parks, many other things named for him during or after the tour. A mountain in New Hampshire, a charity for widows in Delaware, a professorship in Nashville, babies, songs, even a 500-pound cheese in Georgetown, Kentucky. But Lafayette's farewell cannot be reduced simply to a phenomenon of popular culture. It was a time for Americans to reflect on their past and dream about their future. And it was a prelude to the 50th anniversary of the country. And I think it can inspire how we celebrate the 250th. It was a celebration of liberty. The countless number of banquets held for Lafayette usually ended with a round of toasts to him, to his son, to his adopted father, other heroes of the Revolution, but also to the freedoms won by it, to a form of government created to preserve them. In the procession that brought Lafayette into Philadelphia, the city's printers carried a mobile press, and from it, they produced a sheet of paper that read, "Freedom of the press protects all other freedoms." During Lafayette's visit, Americans were reaffirming the singularity of their rights and showing off to the kings and queens of Europe the superiority of representative government. And Lafayette was happily witnessing the growth and progress made possible by it. Our semi-quincentennial is an opportunity to once again marvel at the singularity of our values, our rights, and our institutions. Americans were even contemplating their values when it came to Lafayette himself. Some men and women were wrestling with the compatibility of their republicanism with the frenzied reaction their fellow citizens were having at the sight of the nation's guest. Some thought it was a form of idolatry and inconsistent with the spirit of a revolution fought against a king. A woman named Elizabeth Crosby wrote a beautiful letter to a friend describing Lafayette's reception in Boston. All the spectacle, she observed, was quite ridiculous. But then she could not help but be moved, not just by Lafayette, but by the old veterans of the Revolution on their crutches, the widows of those who had gone to their grave. How could one look on the scene without feeling a pull at their heart or a sense of incredible gratitude? If there was a time for hysteria, it was now. That's because this event, its profound emotional impact on America, was not just about Lafayette, it was about all the other old veterans of the Revolution. They hobbled forward from the crowds. They were lifted on the platforms to shake his hand and remind him of their service together, or just proudly say the words, Brandywine, Yorktown. In Natchez, Mississippi, one old man even ripped open his shirt to show Lafayette the scars he still bore from that former battle. Others donned the very coats they had worn into battle half a century prior, with bullet holes still visible. For many of them, it was the last great day of their lives. Even if they had nothing, they were recognized by General Lafayette and the roaring crowds. Now, on our 250th anniversary, it's another occasion to revere our veterans, to honor their sacrifices and our commitments to them. During Lafayette's visit, some Americans were determined to do this even against his interests. In December 1824, Congress voted to give Lafayette $200,000 in a township of land as compensation for his service in our Revolution. Recall that it was only in 1818 that the federal government offered lifelong pensions to impoverished veterans. 2 years later, this was amended, requiring the documentation of financial need, which prohibited some men and their families from receiving assistance and threw others off the rolls. It was not until 1832 that pensions were more widely available. A handful of legislators took considerable political risk and voted against giving Lafayette the $200,000. They could not do so, especially with so little deliberation and documentation, when so many other veterans of the Revolution were regularly begging them for assistance. Now, after Congress had voted, Lafayette himself wrote that he would have sided with the minority. I was recently shown a letter in a private collection written by Lafayette to 3 veterans of the Revolution in Boston, dating from November 1825, so after the tour had concluded. In it, he hoped that if any good came from Congress's generosity, it would show the U.S. government that they could afford to meet the needs of his brother soldiers. Lafayette's visit in a time of division also reminds us of the power of memory and the importance of not abandoning our passionate political debates, but finding space outside of them to recall our common citizenship. In the Federalist Papers, James Madison had reasoned that Americans were knit together by so many cords of affection. In 1817, in his inaugural address delivered just north of here, James Monroe spoke of powerful causes which had drawn the American people together. Arriving in the middle of a divisive election, Lafayette and all the old soldiers of the Revolution and the remaining statesmen of the era became those links and causes in living form. And Lafayette intended this. In the papers of William Crawford here at the library, in the manuscript division, the Library of Congress, by the way, doesn't just have the best collection in the world, it has the best librarians in the world. Several letters reveal that Lafayette, on the eve of his departure for France, planned to avoid any involvement in politics in America directly and remind its citizens of the value of union. And indeed, the excitement over Lafayette's return quickly eclipsed the bitter presidential election that was underway when he arrived. Sure, newspaper editors and their readers were far more interested in Lafayette than Adams, Clay, Crawford, and Jackson. But Lafayette himself observed a national reconciliation of sorts and the grand celebration of the past. He wrote that, "I have the satisfaction of thinking that my presence has had a great reconciliatory effect between the two parties. Men who have not spoken to each other for over 20 years are brought together and mutually invited to celebrate us. All because, in his words, memories of the Revolution have come back to life. Perhaps it would do us some good, help us remember the chords of affection, to revive those memories once more." But of course, the Revolution is ongoing. In September 1824, after traveling up the Hudson, Lafayette wrote to a fellow Frenchman, "You cannot imagine how I was struck by the miracle wrought here by 48 years of independence, instruction in government and liberty. It surpasses my imagination, I know." But thrilled as he was by the progress he beheld, Lafayette did not ignore areas where the Revolution was incomplete. He was heartsick at the sight of slavery. "There's only one issue for which I am less resigned than ever, and that is slavery and anti-black prejudice," he wrote from New Orleans. In private, he nudged his friends, Jefferson and Madison. but he would not publicly scold his hosts or denigrate their achievements. Instead, Lafayette, who had long opposed slavery, searched for ways to end it, spoke by gesture. In New York, he visited the city's free school for black children. In the South, he met in plain view with black men who had served in the Revolution. He asked purposely to meet with a battalion of free black men who had fought in the Battle of New Orleans. And he reminded them all, and everyone else in earshot, of the valuable contributions black soldiers had made during the American Revolution. One of my favorites, he told the people of Gallipolis, many of them French expatriates in Ohio, how lucky they were to live on the northern banks of the Ohio River, where slavery could not breathe. Lafayette could take incredible joy in the pride and progress he had beheld across America, but signaled to its citizens where great work remained. On reflection, it's not difficult to believe that Lafayette would contend today that the world is better off because of America. He might also admit that America has some shortcomings, but then he might add that the framers left behind the means for future generations of Americans to address those imperfections and continue on the work of their revolution. And what a great way to look at the history of this country over the last 2.5 centuries. I'll just close by sharing that just as a brilliant rainbow greeted Lafayette when he arrived in New York in August of 1824, when the Brandywine took him to sea and back to France in September of the following year, another one descended from the heavens. You can make of that whatever you wish. Thank you. And Kevin and Chuck are now going to join me on stage, and we're going to take your questions.
Ryan, thank you. Thank you so much for all that we've learned already. In fact, you have opened up questions and things that I'd love to know more about that I hadn't even thought of in advance after reading the book and thinking about what I wanted to talk with you about. And one of the things you mentioned up there that I hadn't planned to inquire about is exhaustion, because it does sound like a really remarkably full 13 months. Can you actually, do you have any sense of Lafayette feeling the toll of this during the moment? Because the little bit you gave us made it sound like he was the one man unaffected by the exhaustion of this tour. What do you know?
It's interesting to think about that before leaving France. Actually, in the years leading up, Lafayette was in ill health constantly and bedridden and struggling with gout. And then there was all sorts of, time wouldn't allow us to get into details, but personal things going on in the family before we left. Grandchildren was sick, his sister-in-law was on her deathbed, and then he had, it's in, talked a little bit about in the book, a relationship with this Frances Wright, Scottish reformer and author, and whether she was going to come on the trip with him. There was a tension within the family, so he's dealing with all this, and he's actually sick in the days leading up to leaving. So he gets back here, and then there's that wonderful letter. Actually, I think it's Levasseur writes the letter. By the way, I just want to really quickly, since I'm mentioning a letter, I just want to, she's going to be embarrassed, but Anna Plotnick, who I'm looking at right now, helped me out, was my colleague and collaborator on this project and hunted for so many letters, and the book couldn't have been written without her. So I'm looking at her, so I got to thank her right now. Yes, please clap for her. I'm sorry. I warned you. So one of those letters that we found, Levasseur is saying, we are all sick. They actually all had colds. Levasseur was sick, George Washington, Lafayette was sick, and that Lafayette was acting like a 20-year-old again. So I was stunned by a man his age who had been suffering from gout, Chuck can speak to this, the number of miles covered, the number of parties.
6,000 miles.
6,000, the number of parties.
Endless, more than one party a day. Usually multiple parties a day.
Handshaking, speeches.
He was 67 years old, and back then 67 was a considerable age. Think about that.
There's another letter that Lafayette wrote to his daughters when they are staying. I think they stayed, I can't remember how many days, 10 days at Monticello in the fall of 1824, where he says, I don't know what happened to my gouty disposition. I'm completely energized by this. So, famously, Lafayette had a canine appetite for fame as Jefferson observed. And I think that that appetite was satiated wildly and it energized him during the tour. It's an incredible feat to stand up to 13 months of what we just referred to.
And Chuck, you know the scope and scale of this tour quite well from having thought about and worked to plan commemorations and observations all around the country. Can you give us a sense of the scope and scale as you see it?
Yeah, so the American Friends of Lafayette followed him around exactly as it happened every day. So in those 13 months, we held an event pretty much every day. So yeah, we were tired. We were exhausted, and we weren't shaking hands and whatnot. But so every day Lafayette was somewhere. We had a Lafayette there as an interpreter, interpreting Lafayette and reenacting in that town's exactly what happened. And in many cases, that was the most important thing that ever happened to that town, even to this day in some of the towns we visited. I would like to say that one of the Lafayettes that we did tour around with is in the room with us today. So we do have one of our interpreters watching us today. So I'm happy he's here. But so we followed him around, and we did pretty much try to stay as historically accurate as possible. And what we tried to do was educate the public not only about Lafayette as a incredible, important general of the Revolutionary War, but as a civil rights leader, as a civil rights champion. He was an abolitionist, and he showed this by embracing African Americans in public, which was unheard of back then. He was a feminist. He showed this by asking the opinions of women and seeking their advice, which was unheard of back then. He was the friend of the Native Americans. He left parties early, much to the people's chagrin, to meet with Native Americans in that area. So Lafayette really embodied what he thought America was supposed to be about. And Ryan, you're right. He was very disappointed about slavery in our country. And these are the things we tried to do as we traveled around the country with Lafayette in 2025 and 2020, in 2024 and 2025.
Can I just add something real quick to what Chuck said? So I've gone around and given some talks after publishing this book, and I've been lucky enough to go to a couple of the places where Lafayette was. It was in Henry Clay's house, Ashland and Lexington, Kentucky, a couple other places. Marietta, Ohio was one I'm thinking of, where Lafayette was literally there about an hour. Mm-hmm. And when he visited Henry Clay's house, Clay wasn't even there. He was here. And yet you go there and people show up and they know about the tour. Now, I want to give American Friends of Lafayette some love because they've cultivated that. But it also speaks to the magnitude of this event that 200 years later, people still remember, they still turn out, they come to places where he was just passing through. It's incredible.
It is. And think about Marietta, Ohio. There's rumors that he didn't even get off the boat. He waved as he went by. But
don't tell them that.
But there's a Lafayette Hotel in Marietta, Ohio. So it shows you exactly what the feeling was then and now.
So I've spent a lot of time with Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont, who made a tour in 1831. And when they came, and they were not famous people, they were not Lafayette by any means, but when they came, when you read the papers of the day, Americans took note, in part because I could tell they felt honored that Europe was paying attention, right? So they knew that these young Frenchmen were coming to, in this case, better understand America's prison system. And they really felt like Europe was watching them just by knowing that these two young men were coming to investigate America and report back. Give me a sense of European views of this. You touched on this briefly, Ryan, but I'd love to hear more from both you and Chuck about what Americans thought Europe was seeing in this moment.
My impression was, I think one of the reasons that Lafayette was eager to come, there were a number of reasons. One was the sentimental part, but also there was a political component, is to show, I would say transmit back to France and Europe after a period of some revolutionary advancement in the early 1820s, which excited Lafayette in Portugal and Spain and the Italian peninsula, to show Europe the superiority of our form of government, that man could govern himself, and it wasn't just coming here and seeing across the street. What it was obviously the Erie Canal, the waterworks in Philadelphia was civic society, that civil society that had grown, going to visit schools and museums, especially in the western states. And I think that was a way, I would say, was showing off. I think that Americans were proud to show off through Lafayette to Europe the superiority of their forms of government to the monarchs across the Atlantic. That's always been my interpretation of what this event is about.
And then not only did he show off things that were technology driven or new to, like bridges or dams or things like that, but also Niagara Falls. Many Europeans had never seen that. But I think what Europeans saw was a man that was only supposed to stay 3 months ended up staying 13 months. This trip was only supposed to be for 3 months. So Europeans are watching every town. He wasn't supposed to go as far west as St. Louis. He wasn't supposed to go to New Orleans. He went to all 24 states because everybody wanted a piece of Lafayette. When he first publicly showed himself on that August 16th in New York City, 90,000 people came out to see him. There was only 110,000 people that lived in New York at the time. When the Beatles came in 1964, only 4,000 people. So Lafayette is truly America's first rock star.
What about Taylor Swift?
Well, okay, so I can't compete with Taylor Swift, but I will say this about Taylor Swift and Lafayette. The invention of the souvenir. Lafayette, and you mentioned this, really was the invention of the souvenir in America. They put his face on everything, and that's the same with Miss Swift.
You know, Chuck said something that I didn't get a chance to talk about in the talk, and I don't talk about a lot, but there's a sense of discovery in this tour, which you could put it up compared to Lewis and Clark in some ways, much smaller scale, but these Frenchmen had never seen some of these. You mentioned the Niagara Falls, just a great example, but they seeing wildlife, they were seeing alligators for the first time, and Levasseur in particular, his letters capture a sense of wonder, and there was a manuscript that when they're in Alabama, at the home of Big Warrior, who was a Creek who had just died in Washington the month before. They see these fluorescent lights in the forest, and Levasseur doesn't know what they are, and he runs out into the forest to try and grab one. And he says they're falling and rising, and he asks one of the Creek who's with, "What are those?" And they said, "Fireflies." So there's a real interesting sense of natural discovery as part of this tour that it's low down in the things we talk about, but it's there.
I want to come to questions from all of you, including those of you online, and we'll do that after I ask one more question. So be ready, and we'll go first to the room and then online. One thing you may have mentioned it briefly, but I also know that Freemasons, the institution of Freemasonry, was important in the reception of Lafayette at lots of places. So Ryan, I wonder if you could speak to it in 1824-25, and Chuck, I'd love to hear where Freemasons of the 21st century fit in.
Well, you know what? We had a conversation, you and I, Kevin, many years ago, or a correspondence, where you said, if you're going to tell this story, this is a huge part of the story that you have to tell. So you cannot look at any of the itinerary, any of the events, whether you're in New York, right, or you're in Alabama, anywhere where there's not a Masonic element of this tour. That's banquets, right, parades. They participate in all the parades. I thought really interesting is that there's a number of, I mentioned in my talk that this is a period of nostalgia for the revolution. It's also a period of memorializing the revolution and revolutionary heroes. And when Lafayette goes into the South, he presides over the laying of cornerstones for monuments to DeKalb and Pulaski and Greene. And these all have it's all Masonic ceremonies. Lafayette, of course, was a Mason himself. You can't imagine what a huge part of this tour it was, but what I find is really interesting, and something that you actually pointed out to me, is that this is a high watermark for Masonry in the early 20th century. Anyone who was, I was looking at this, and I think you talk about this in your book even, that anyone who was ambitious in public life in America at this point in time was a Mason, was public Mason. Jackson, DeWitt Clinton, who were amongst the two most popular men in the country at the time. And obviously there was a lot of important civic and philanthropic parts of Masonry. But the next year, right, the Morgan Affair, when a disgruntled Mason is threatening or about to publish the secrets of Masonry, ends up dead, right? It is the beginning of a very precipitous decline in the popularity of Masonry that lasts for decades and then creates our first independent political party, right?
But there's a revival, obviously, of Freemasonry, and it still exists very much today. Chuck, where do they fit into the last 2 years?
I got to tell you, they came out in droves. The Masonic community was very generous, very anxious to be involved. If we didn't reach out to them in the community, they certainly reached out to us. All of our committees around the country engaged with the Masonic community. Two reasons. Number one, we knew Lafayette would wanted us to do that. And number two, we knew that the Masonic community would be anxious to help out. They have somewhat of a PR problem, in my opinion, and we wanted people to see that they were, these are upstanding citizens within their community, and this is why Lafayette associated himself with them. So, in Philadelphia, big towns like New York City, the Masonic, but even little towns in Louisiana and what's not, everybody came out that was the Masonic, and it was important to us, and it was important to the public to see that, and we really embraced that.
Let's go to questions from the room. And Mike, I see one in the front row, and then we'll go to the third row. Front row. Right.
Did Lafayette comment on the Louisiana Purchase in 1803?
During the, you mean after the purchase or during during the time? I don't know to comment on it. I mean, it was obviously Jefferson floated the idea of him becoming the governor. And what's most relevant to that, actually, I think, in terms of comment, I have answered your question, is that the federal government once Lafayette had returned to France, was destitute, all his possessions were taken during the Revolution, that the United States government had made a special point to try and help restore his finances. And Congress originally granted him land in the Northwest Territory and then realized that land in the Louisiana Purchase was more likely to be valuable sooner and settled more quickly, then ended up granting him a number of acres in the Louisiana Purchase, which then becomes a real headache because he's got to get, like Madison ends up being things. Madison and Monroe, he deputizes as his agents, and they become harried very quickly because he's continually trying to locate land. They find the land for him, but it's already purchased, I believe, by the city of New Orleans. So this is actually, I'm going on and on. I'll end this real quickly. Lafayette backs away from the land that had originally been picked for him by his agent, which comes up during the debate in the end of 1824 about giving him $200,000 because the land that he ceded to the city of New Orleans appreciated in value so greatly. So it's used by some senators and representatives to make the case that the country should give Lafayette $200,000 because he gave up this valuable land.
But he was eventually given land in Tallahassee, Florida, right? And that is still, and there is a Lake Lafayette there where that land was. So,
there's a question over here. Let's go to the third row, and then back for online, and then front row again, Mike.
Thank you very much for a really great book. I had a question about Lafayette's legacy and sort of his understanding, including the return and sort of the broader Americas, right? Thinking of Haiti, all of the revolutionary movements that were happening in Latin America after the American Revolution, and around the same time as his return to the U.S. So just wondering your thoughts on that broader impact of him. Also bearing in mind we've done all these 200 years of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and so many Latin American countries. So it's an interesting moment in that bilateral context. Thank you.
Interestingly, I think it was in the summer of 1825, he's writing to Simon Bolivar, actually. I would say Lafayette was thrilled by revolution, especially at this point of his life. I mentioned in Southern Europe and also in the Americas. Lafayette's correspondence with Monroe after the Monroe Doctrine is issued is quite stirring about how energized he was. So, the short answer to your question was I think they're hugely supportive of revolutionary movements in the Americas.
Poland, Greece.
Greece.
If you go to Lagrange, his retirement home, in the attic is Polish graffiti. He hid Polish revolutionaries in his house. He was involved all over the world with revolutions. He wanted to topple despotism at any cost.
Question from online.
Two quick questions online. The first one, can you comment on why so much of the European press, especially after 1800, dare not to mention Lafayette unless in a derogatory, demeaning way? And the second one, who paid for all these tributes, travel, and gatherings?
Well, the first one, Chuck may want to jump in on this, is my interpretation, though, has been that Lafayette's I always like to say Lafayette's participation in our revolution is very different than his participation in France's revolution. It's one of the reasons why Lafayette is adored here and is a much more complicated figure in France. It's much more pristine, his involvement here, and the image we have of him. And, Chuck said something earlier when we were talking that I always say Lafayette, early on in the French Revolution, one of the great heroes, riding his white horse, and very quickly lost the trust of both the royals and the radicals, but tried to please everybody, tried to be a mediating. It's interesting, I alluded to in my talk, he tried to be a mediating presence in America when he showed up in 1824. He was trying to do that during the French Revolution and it turned on him. But it's a much more complicated legacy. I just want to answer, and I'll let Chuck jump in here, but in terms of the cost, a lot of the states, the cities, localities footed the bill for a lot of these events, and I was able to access some of the actual itemized budgets from some of the states during the tour, and Alabama in particular was fascinating to me because it was a relatively new state, hadn't settled on a permanent capital, didn't have a university, and so they spent wildly on this. You can actually see in Alabama State Archives refurbishing buildings, hiring bands, buying bourbon, hams, venison, all these things. It was reckless. Some of these places spent so wildly, and in some ways they were competing with one another to see who could have the greatest celebration for the nation's guest. But there was a lot of public spending on this.
Yeah, a lot of competition amongst the locations, right? They all wanted to have the best situation for Lafayette, and they all competed with it. So yeah, a lot of money was spent, but a lot of money was raised. If I had to say one thing about Lafayette and the way the French see him now, if he's guilty of one thing, he's guilty of trying to make everybody happy. And I think you alluded to this. He wanted to keep the monarchs happy. He wanted to keep the revolutionaries happy. And he thought a constitutional monarchy would work. It did not work. And, when you try to keep everybody happy, what happens? You make nobody happy. And that seems to be his legacy in France.
Other questions? I see we have a very young person in the front row with a question, and then we'll come to this side of the room. Wait for the microphone, please. Here you go.
Did Lafayette like baguettes?
Did he like baguettes?
Baguettes?
Yes. Oui.
He liked duck. There are some contemporary recollections of what he was eating. And I believe maybe it was Rachel Jackson. No, I'm sorry. It was William Winston Seton, who was the publisher, one of the capital newspapers, a description of him eating in Baltimore, that he could eat a whole duck and empty a bottle of Bordeaux himself. So I don't know about, yes, actually, you know what? In that same description, we're family, so I can follow up with her later. Sure. I'm almost sure that he was eating loaves of bread. So let's just assume they were baguettes.
When he was a young man, and he got, after the Battle of Brandywine, he was convalescing in Bethlehem. And the Moravian nuns there would bake him this special cake that he loved. And we have the recipe. The American Friends of Lafayette bake that cake at many of our meetings. We had it in many of our tour sites, and it was his favorite sweet. I'll get you that recipe, okay?
I would like that too.
You got it.
From this side. Yes, sir. There's a mic.
How closely were the Europeans following his tour? Were they paying any attention at all?
I think the English in particular were sneering at it. There was editorials in English newspapers making fun of the whole thing. Number one, it was, as I mentioned in my talk, there were some Americans who were observing this as well. Was this compatible? There's these Americans and all their pretenses towards republicanism are engaging in idolatry, right? And another common commentary I noticed amongst the English in particular was, I love this, they were saying, well, Lafayette, they're bringing Lafayette to America, but I haven't seen them paying for anything yet, which was alluding to whether they were going to give him the financial support or not. I thought the response in France was more complicated, actually. I think that there was actually some pride in France. Number one, him leaving after being voted out of the Chamber of Deputies. He would argue he was not actually voted. It was government chicanery. There was no worry about him leaving. I mean, they were happy to have him go. He was not a factor anymore since he was out of office. But I think there was a sense of pride, actually. And then when Lafayette leaves the country in July of 1824, those huge crowds form to wish him farewell. And then when he gets back In 1825, crowds gather and follow him as he heads back home. So I always thought there actually was a sense of pride amongst the French about this event.
Bigger crowds when he arrived back. In 1825, it was quite a large crowd. I think they flipped a little bit. I think in the beginning they were looking down their nose at the door a little bit. And then what I've read is over time they were impressed by this, the magnitude of it. They didn't realize it was going to be such a big deal. And that's when this pride took over.
So we'll take 3 more questions, 2 from the room, one from online. We'll go here, online, and then over here. Mike?
Chalmers Hood, I'm a French historian, but of a much later period, and what you just said rings a bell. During the Second World War, we in Britain could not agree on how to handle France. Churchill and Roosevelt couldn't agree. And behind it all was Anthony Eden's vision of what the problem was. And he said, the problem is the Americans have this Lafayette complex, and if we can defeat it, then the war will be run our way. It's not a question, it's just a comment, but it kind of falls in right on top of what you were saying there.
Well, when General Pershing liberated Paris, the first place he went, literally, the first place he went was Lafayette's grave to let him know, we got your back.
Let's go to online questions.
Someone online wanted to know where in the United States you could find papers of Lafayette.
Well, Cornell is the greatest repository. Here at the library. Actually, something that was unfair, as another historian said to me, the Lilly Library in Bloomington, Indiana, which is about 2 miles from where I live, has a little known but incredible collection, which I only accessed a portion of because I was focusing really largely on these 1820s and the late 18 teens, but going all the way back to before the Revolution, Cleveland State, right? But for the research in this book, historical societies specific to the tour, there are fragments and clues spread out along in historical societies across the country, particularly in the 24 states that Lafayette visited. And even if it was just 1 or 2 letters, a lot of them shed incredible light on the tour and what he was thinking and what he was feeling.
I got to add 2 more.
Lafayette College, right?
University of Chicago, because Scott
Right,
Shaw
that's right.
was a professor there. And of course, Lafayette College. The American Friends of Lafayette were born at Lafayette College in 1932, and we now boast 2,000 members around the country. Many of them are in this room and watching us right now.
And one last question right there.
Yes, thank you for a brilliant lecture and a great book. I wanted to ask, as a Washingtonian, you've been talking about all of the Lafayette places around the country, but the most prominent, one of the most prominent parks and memorials here is right across from the White House, the Lafayette Square, and that extraordinarily beautiful statue that I think a lot of Washingtonians really don't know much about. Wondering about when the park came to be Lafayette Square or Lafayette Park, and perhaps a little bit about that great piece of artwork.
I think Jacqueline Kennedy was the person that started Lafayette Park, and the 4 corners are 4 European people that helped us during the Revolutionary War, and that would be Lafayette, Rochambeau, Kosciuszko, and von Steuben, right. One fun fact about the Lafayette statue in the Lafayette Square, and by the way, it is not Lafayette in the center of Lafayette Square. But fun fact about Lafayette statue is you'll see there's several gentlemen underneath the statue, and one of them happens to be Rochambeau. And I have a feeling General Rochambeau wouldn't have really appreciated being underneath Lafayette in that statue. Luckily, he's on the other corner. Yeah, it is a beautiful square, and they're redoing the square, and it is apparently the most visited national park in our country.
I have 4 things I want to say in closing. First of all, books will be available, and Ryan will be eager to sign them for you. We have a reception that we hope you will stay for. That doesn't apply to those of you online, but for the rest of you, please stay. Third thing, I think I've just forgotten. No, it's surveys, and I hope that you will fill out your surveys and tell us more about how we can make these events successful for you. And the 4th thing is what I forgot, but let's, it was to thank Ryan and Chuck. Please join me in thanking Ryan and Chuck for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.